Welcome to Alternate History with James Pigeon, and today the episode is on What if the North lost the Civil War? Well, in terms of the alternate history community, I know that this has already been done to death, so I'm really just using this as an excuse to publicly debut one of my old alternate history timelines. In fact, the first alternate history, called the Dixie Wars. So yeah, my first timeline, it's pretty bad. Just remember that if this timeline is unrealistic, which it is, don't crash out too hard because this was the first timeline I ever made. So let's get into it. On a chilly afternoon of February 14th, 1862, in Fort Donelson, Tennessee, a young brigadier general named Ulysses S. Grant is struck by a stray mini-ball and killed in action. He is buried with full military honors and generally forgotten to history, only being remembered by history buffs, primarily for his service in the Mexican-American War. Under the command of General Halleck, the Western Theater slows to a halt without Grant's military genius. After some initial gains, the rebels win a decisive battle just north of Nashville, cementing the front lines as trenches are dug and spring turns the South into a field of suffocating mud. New Orleans is never captured, as the Yanks are unable to take control of the Mississippi River, and it remains a vital connection between the East and West for the Confederate military. As the war grinds to a halt in the Western Theater, the East is seeing more action. Meanwhile, the Rebs are pushing north into a small town in Pennsylvania, Gettysburg. In the unseasonably warm July of 1863, the rebel army under Robert E. Lee is able to encircle George Meade's forces and capture 60,000 Northern soldiers, the biggest Southern victory in the war. Building on the stress for the Northern states, the New York draft riots turn far, far worse. The black citizens of the city being almost entirely lynched in one of the worst episodes of racial violence in United States history. Federals are finally able to wrestle control of the city back from the rioters, but the damage has been done. The city lays in ruins and near anarchy. As George Meade commits suicide, key Northern Democrats, Copperheads, like Fernando Wood and Alexander Long begin to hold secret peace talks with Southern leaders. The deal? If the Democrats beat Lincoln in the 1864 election, they will strike a peace deal with the Confederate States of America, letting the South have its independence, and preserving the peculiar institution, slavery, indefinitely. Well, November of 1864 comes around and the North has seen no progress, with mass desertions of ethnic minorities like the Irish and just regular troops. The Union also never allows black soldiers to join for fear of retaliation, and because of this, they lose out on over 200,000 sailors and soldiers, 10% of their forces in our own timeline. Losing the key states of New York, Pennsylvania, and Indiana, George McClellan beats Abraham Lincoln in the election by 2 electoral votes, 118 to 116. As McClellan takes office in March of 1865, the North settles for peace. After 4 years of war, the violence is over, but the country is not whole. The great experiment has failed, at least in a big way. The continual American attempt to curb regionalism and rally around an ideal, bigger than themselves, has fallen for the sake of preserving the Southern economy and the white supremacy it was built on, not even 100 years after the Declaration of Independence. So now the South has its freedom. The Confederate States of America are free to continue their centuries-old lifestyle, or at least they think. In the center of Richmond, Jefferson Davis proclaimed Southern independence with a public reading of the Confederate Constitution. String bands play I Wish I Was in Dixie in the streets, as it seems like a new age of prosperity for the Old South has begun. But war isn't cheap. The CSA government has racked up mountains of debt from Mexico and other Latin American countries to buy arms and food, the only way to get supplies across the northern blockade being across the Mexican border itself. To pay for the immense debts, Jefferson Davis is forced to levy immense taxes on the southern states. Britain offers economic aid under one condition: the abolition of slavery. As moderates and poor whites talk about taking up the Brits on their offer, tensions brew in the most slave-dependent regions of the Deep South. Jefferson Davis is assassinated by a former slave in January of 1866 with a grenade thrown into his bed while sleeping, killing the Confederate president, his wife, and his daughter. As his funeral procession passes through New Orleans, tensions are high about the fate of the world's newest nation. Tennessee makes the first move, declaring independence from the CSA in July of 1866 and declaring the Republic of Tennessee. Hampered by decentralization, the Confederacy is unable to win back the territory. Next goes the frontier state of Texas. Only 4 months later, Mexico is drawn into the war to protect its debt. However, the combined forces of Mexico and the CSA are not enough to stop the Texans, as they regain their independence after only 20 years. As the rest of the states slowly break away, only Virginia is left as the Confederate States of America. With every state independent, they start fighting amongst themselves as Russian Civil War-esque terror and confusion breaks out. A famine hits the South in 1869, killing over 1 million people, as outbreaks of cholera ravage Dixie. The South is essentially reduced to medieval living conditions. Lacking the coordination to import gunpowder, bow and sword-based combat becomes more popular. The Indians in Oklahoma declare their independence too, as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman lead mass uprisings of slaves and lead them as guerrilla armies. An epidemic of racial violence strikes the South. Free blacks who haven't already escaped are re-enslaved or murdered. By 1876, the chaos has reduced Dixie to an absolute mess of violence, every state looking out for their interests, rich families buying private armies of Cherokee warriors to enforce their property rights, and marauding bands of freed slaves leading a campaign of terror. The North, led now by radical Republican Samuel J. Randall, makes the call. They're taking it back. In early 1876, the North sweeps down through the South, retaking the last bastions of Florida just in time for the centennial. Most poor Southerners are just thankful for the rule of law. By 1920, all states are reincorporated and all guerrilla violence has ended, as the Federals pull out of Dixie once again. To reduce their power in the Senate, the Southern states have been merged. Texas and Louisiana, Arkansas and Mississippi, Florida, Georgia and Alabama, and the Carolinas are fused, much like the military districts of our own timeline, reducing the South's amount of senators by 10. The U.S. is whole again, at a very high cost. So yeah, in retrospect, this timeline was pretty unrealistic, even by alternate history standards, but it was my first ever, and I hope you enjoyed it. I like to think that the timelines I make nowadays are a lot better, so let me know if you'd like to see any of them. Or if you have any recommendations for new alternate history timelines I can make and publish, or just recommendations for new types of videos. I'm trying to move away from the conlang reviews, at least entirely. I'll probably still make them. It's just, there aren't really infinite conlangs out there, and a lot of them are pretty similar, so I think the videos are kind of blending into each other, so I'm going to try to diversify, make some stuff about things I'm interested in, like nuclear physics, archaeology, history, really diversify the content here to, give it a better future so we don't run out of stuff. But yeah, let me know what you thought in the comments, and goodbye.